are live. No. All right, guys, it looks like we are live. Come on in, one and all. Great to have you here. Let me know the sound is all right in the chat. I see you guys are already getting the chat going. You look terrific. It is live stream Friday. Make sure to smack that bell and subscribe button if you haven't already done so. You know, we've got so much to talk about. Super chats are up, so send me your questions. I'll answer them at the end of the video. And today, really what I want to do is I want to just sit back with you and just kind of like what I did last Saturday on my back porch. I just want to savor the absolutely astonishing victories that we got this latest term from the Supreme Court. You know, this was the very first full year that Amy Coney Barrett sat on the court, sort of solidifying that Trumpian conservative majority because, you know, when all said and done, this was a term like no other. It was a Supreme Court term where conservatives and patriots, again, not perfect, but, you know, all things considered, this was a Supreme Court term where conservatives and patriots, those of us who love faith, family, and freedom, saw one historic victory after another, and another, from crushing the administrative state and its unconstitutional mandates, to upholding the Second Amendment and religious liberties, to ultimately overturning the liberal left's most prized achievement in 50 years, Roe v. Wade. What Trump's Supreme Court did, and that's what I like to call it here, what Trump's Supreme Court did was simply unprecedented. So I just thought, you know, there couldn't be a better way to just sort of start off our 4th of July weekend, our weekend of patriotism and nationalism, by savoring each and every one of these incredible wins. But first, a real quick question here, gang. Historically, question for you. What commodity has been able to weather every financial storm over the past tens of thousands of years, right? Maybe not tens of thousands, but several thousands of years. You know the answer. You know the answer of what commodity, when all is said and done, is able to withstand any financial storm like no other. Thanks so much, Live Freedom. God bless you guys. Yeah, keep in mind, the super chat's on. Go ahead, give me your questions. I'll answer them at the end. You know what that commodity is. You know it. It is gold, or more specifically, gold and silver. And gang, as Biden and the Dems are absolutely wrecking our economy, you don't have to suffer like so many others are out there, because we got the best friends anyone could ask for at a time like this, and that's the Patriots over at Goldco. If you don't know them, make sure to click on that link below and give them a visit. Goldco is a Patriot gold company that specializes in helping you find out how you can protect your retirement with the trustworthiness of gold and silver. And guess what, gang? If you sign up today, if you open up an account with them, they're going to give you $10,000. That's right, 10 G's in free silver. They're one of us, gang. They're Patriots. It's a limited time offer, though, so don't wait. Click on that link below, or go to turleytalkslikesgold.com. I love that URL, turleytalkslikesgold.com, and let's weather this financial storm together with the timeless value of gold. All right, gang, let's dive right in here. When President Trump promised us that we would be winning, he was not exaggerating. This here is President Trump's Supreme Court, okay? When you read all the assessments of Trump's 4 years in office, one of the most common refrains that pundits and scholars have made here in their observations is that what Trump did with the courts, the whole federal court system, with the apex being the crown jewel being the Supreme Court, that is going to outlast his tenure unlike anything else. Make no mistake, if we had listened to never-Trumpers like David French and Jonah Goldberg and the coastal elites at National Review, if we had listened to George W. Bush and Mitt Romney and Liz Cheney and John McCain and John Kasich and George Will and Bill Kristol, both of whom are just left-wing hacks at this point, and all those neocon rhino freaks, the Supreme Court today would have 6 Ruth Bader Ginsburgs on it, lurching the nation as a whole to the far left for the next generation. But instead, you and I listened to a call. I think I speak on behalf of all of us when I say that we believe with all of our hearts that this was a divine call. It was a very literal, very real divine call. And it was a call to first and foremost turn away from the globalist elites that constitute our permanent political class. And instead, we were being called to return. We were being called to reject the siren songs of the technocratic millionaire class that promised us for decades endless happiness and bliss if we would but just give them more and more control over our lives. Instead, we were called to embrace. We were called to embrace, like never before, our cultures, our customs, our traditions, our religious and spiritual foundations, and go all in with a fellow who without question was not personally perfect, like any of us are, but as God has always drawn straight lines with crooked sticks, it turns out, though not personally perfect, we were called to go all in with the perfect one for the task at hand. And in the course of 4 years, President Donald J. Trump, the first Republican presidential candidate to win over 300 electoral votes in 30 years, appointed 3 Supreme Court justices, one of whom, of course, was the target of unprecedented leftist hysterics and was even subject to an actual assassination attempt. Those 3 Supreme Court justices would join forces with 2 others, sometimes 3 others, depending on whether John Roberts took his meds that day. And together, as either a 5 or 6 vote majority, together, they would faithfully fulfill that call. That very call that we originally answered, the call to return. The call to take back our nation from the radical, secular, woke elite that pervade our permanent political class and reawaken the timeless values of faith, family, and freedom. This is why I call this Supreme Court Trump's court, which means that this is our court. This is the court of faith, family, and freedom. This year, for the first time in memory, and I see some of the questions on the Mexico policy, that would be one of the ones I would disagree with. We'll talk about it at the end, what their rationale was. But this year, for the first time in recent memory, the Supreme Court consistently and profoundly, in some of the most well-reasoned legal decisions in our history, defended the Constitution of the United States against the onslaught of left-wing neo-Marxist ideology. This court stood up for the rule of law as defined by the Constitution itself and not by the ideological rants of woke college professors and the shrieking and weeping and gnashing of teeth that we've been subject to for the last several months, obviously climaxing with the decisive reversal of Roe v. Wade, is testimony to just how faithful the Supreme Court was to this call. Let's start with the court's crushing of the administrative state, right? Virtually everything Biden and the CDC tried to pull on us got struck down by this court. It all started, if you recall, with the Supreme Court striking down of the CDC, the Center for Disease Control's attempt at playing landlord. Do you remember that? When it had enacted a federal eviction ban during COVID, the court came out and said that the CDC cannot pretend to be a national landlord, a national housing regulator, dictating to landowners what they can and cannot do. That obviously goes way beyond the powers granted to the CDC. So that eviction ban was struck down as unconstitutional. And then, shortly thereafter, the Supreme Court struck down Biden's OSHA vaccine mandate for all workers in all industries and workplaces above 100 employees, right? It was a radically sweeping executive order that affected upwards of 85 million people, totally historically unprecedented. That's 2/3 of American employers. The decision to kill it was 6-3. And the majority ruling affirmed that Congress had never granted OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, anywhere near the authority to enact a mandate of that magnitude. And so Biden's executive order imploded, a second executive order imploded there. Now, of course, the court did uphold the mandate requiring healthcare workers to be vaxxed, which I consider unfortunate. But at the very least, the court noted that there is at least some historical precedent for the HHS, the Health and Human Services Department, to require healthcare workers to meet certain guidelines to ensure the health and safety of Medicare and Medicaid patients. And again, that's the key. Whether it's right or wrong is a different story. At the very least, the reasoning is sound. There is at least some historical precedent for the HHS to mandate requirements for healthcare workers, while there simply was no precedent for OSHA to mandate vaccinations for 85 million people. So that was struck down. And then, as of yesterday, the Supreme Court struck down the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency's attempt at trying to enforce carbon emissions rules that Congress has repeatedly rejected. In other words, as a federal administrative agency, you do not get to bypass Congress. So Trump's Supreme Court has an astonishing message for the administrative state, right? The three-letter federal administrative state. The days of you overstepping your bounds are over. So this was an amazing term in terms of reining in what Steve Bannon likes to call the administrative state. But of course, the court did more than that, right? The court also defended our constitutional rights like never before, like the Second Amendment and religious freedom. Now, gang, by the way, before I forget, if you're just joining us, we have a huge 4th of July special going on our merch store where you can get shirts like this one. I love this shirt. Freedom isn't free, right? You can now get, if you buy 2 shirts, you get 1 absolutely free. It's our gift to you as we celebrate faith, family, and freedom and the birth of our nation. It's solidified by the Supreme Court. So make sure to just click on that link below, visit our awesome merch store, grab a couple of shirts for yourself, get one for the patriot in your life to love you for it. Click on the link below, go to store.turleytalks.com. All right, so this term saw the Supreme Court defending our constitutional rights like never before, and nowhere more dramatically than their 6-3 decision to decisively defend and uphold the Second Amendment and crush gun control once and for all across the country. It was in the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin case, and the court struck down a New York gun control law that required people to show, quote, proper cause to get a license to carry a concealed handgun outside their home, right? So much for your right to bear arms in New York. I mean, keep in mind, the Second Amendment clearly states that American citizens have the right to bear arms. And if you read the Second Amendment, that is the prerequisite That is the prerequisite to a well-ordered militia. That's the prerequisite to it, right? This a bunch of liberals go, yeah, well, a militia's a private army. We didn't have private armies when the Constitution was being written. This is the prerequisite for having a well-regulated militia. It's the right of the citizens to bear arms and therefore be able to constitute that militia. But obviously the Democrat monopoly in New York is clueless on this, but too bad for them. SCOTUS stepped in and struck down the law as blatantly unconstitutional. Hey, gang, thanks for those questions for the super chats. Remember, we're going to answer them at the end. So if you have any questions, throw them in the super chat, and we'll chat about them at the end of the vid. And so SCOTUS stepped in, struck down the law as blatantly unconstitutional. And that's, of course, given our Second Amendment rights, the only single human being on the planet that should decide what the proper cause is for carrying a concealed weapon is who? It's the person carrying it. The person bearing it. I don't need to give a proper cause to exercise my constitutional rights. That's what shall not be infringed means. But then again, we're dealing with, a left-wing ideology that doesn't even know what the definition of a woman is. Then you had the monumental victory for religious freedom, when again, in another 6-3 decision, the court officially affirmed that public school officials most certainly have a constitutional right to publicly pray on school grounds. This was a case involving the high school football coach, Joe Kennedy, who was fired from his position for leading students in a totally voluntary prayer on the 50-yard line after their games. That constitutional right to pray in public schools, which was always acknowledged up until the early 1960s, was it 62 or 63 when the court went utterly insane, 10 years before they brought in Roe, the worst decision in their history. But that constitutional right to pray in public schools has now been officially reinstated. And as far as Christian schools are concerned, the court also ruled that the state of Maine could not exclude religious schools from their state tuition program. So Christian schools are now getting funded by tax dollars in a manner comparable to programs for public schools. And in so doing, the court basically overturned the utterly idiotic decision known as Lemon versus Kurtzman, which was an early 1970s decision right around Roe v. Wade, that made the insidious claim that any, quote, entanglement between a public school and religion was tantamount to establishing a state church. It's so utterly absurd. Again, it was leftist ideology disguised as jurisprudence, and Trump's court has officially banished such woke nonsense from our nation. And then, of course, speaking of the summit, the peak, the glorious mountaintop decision, the king of them all, the overturning of Roe v. Wade, which, as I've argued on this channel, actually constitutes, when all is said and done, actually we talked about it on last week's live stream Friday video, 1 week ago today, it actually constitutes the end of left-wing liberalism. Roe v. Wade, we have to understand, was, I would say is, but Roe v. Wade was the foundation of left-wing liberalism. Roe v. Wade codified into law for the entire nation the left-wing liberal notion that the family is nothing more than a mere lifestyle choice. The traditional conservative vision of the family was totally wiped out by that 7-2 decision. The traditional conservative vision of the family was that the family was the bedrock. It is the foundation of society because it is the sole institution that awakened a sense of moral obligation that I have to others that I did not personally choose for myself, right? The family is the sole institution where we all learn that we are morally obligated to people and places and institutions and nations that we did not personally choose for ourselves, but that chose us. and therefore we have an obligation, a gratitude to honor that inheritance that we've received, right? Not to mention that the family is alone the institution that guarantees the fertility needed for the future flourishing of civilization. That vision of the family was overruled as unconstitutional by the Roe decision. And instead, and again, it's the most insane decision imaginable, if you can think of it, since none of the founding fathers and no major figure in the history of this country up until the beginning of the 20th century, I would argue, even fathomed thinking of the family the way the Roe decision redefined it. Instead, the Roe decision superimposed a radically secular globalist notion of the family onto the entire nation as nothing more than a mere lifestyle choice. The family is nothing more than a mere lifestyle choice that entails no moral obligations whatsoever, none whatsoever, beginning, of course, with the redefinition of the fetus as having no intrinsic value or worth whatsoever. And this is the foundation of leftist liberalism. Without this fundamental principle that the family is nothing more than a lifestyle choice, and that every person is a sovereign individual that has no moral obligations whatsoever apart from that which he or she chooses to impose for themselves, without that fundamental premise, left-wing liberalism collapses. It is in effect replaced with the traditionalist conception of life, which says you and I are all morally obligated to people, places, and institutions, particularly faith institutions, that we did not personally choose, but that chose us. And therefore, gratitude and obligation is the proper orientation, disposition, inclination towards the world in which, or towards the inheritance that we are receiving. So that's why I argued last week that I think the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe was nothing less than the overturning of the liberal left-wing order. And the icing on the cake, and by the way, all the weeping and the gnashing of the teeth that you hear from leftists right now is just further confirmation of that. They recognize that. They recognize really this decision was nothing less than the beginning of the end of their world. And the icing on the cake in all of this is that the constitutional reasoning provided by Sam Alito was so good. It's going to go down in history as one of the best legally reasoned opinions ever penned. It was wonderful. What the court did is they went back to the 14th Amendment, which is what the Roe decision is rooted in. It's what's known as the Liberty Clause, so no state can deprive any person of life, liberty, and property without due process of law. And so the Roe decision obviously ignored life, right, the life clause, and instead fixated on the Liberty Clause. And they argued that a woman has the right, the liberty, inherent in her private life, to get an abortion, and no state can intervene. And so the Trump court, as I like to call it, they applied what's known as a standardized twofold test for determining the legitimacy of that decision. There's a standardized twofold test for determining if a right is included under an amendment, in this case, the 14th Amendment, which is the test of text and tradition. So you may want to write that down if you want to remember the reasoning behind the overturning, because clearly historical woke leftists aren't interested in the reasoning at all. But the reasoning is actually very, very airtight. The twofold test that the Supreme Court justices have used over the years to determine if a right exists in the Constitution, and therefore, governments have the right to impose it on you, as it were. If a right exists in the Constitution, is the test of text and tradition, okay? Text and tradition. So, and this is basic, what's known as hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is the study of any written text. So Hermes was the messenger god, the god of messages, sending them back and forth between humans and the other gods. So that's hermeneutics. So legal hermeneutics first asks is the right that's under, that's being contended, is this right specified in the Constitution? Like owning guns, for example, right? Does the Constitution expressly deal with that right in its text? Well, when it comes to the practice of abortion, the answer to that is an obvious no. Nowhere in the Constitution is the issue of abortion dealt with anywhere. Okay, but then you've got a problem. And the problem is you can't possibly put everything and anything and every single right, every legitimate right imaginable in the text, right? And that's absolutely true. And so then there is a next step. You start with text, but then you go to what's called tradition. If it's not in the text, then the justices look at the history of tradition at the time when the amendment was written, in this case, the 14th Amendment, to see if that right would have been accepted at the time by those who wrote the amendment, who passed the amendment. And so then that means it would have been included among the rights implied by the authors of the amendment. And this is essential. We have to have this twofold test, because without this twofold test of text and tradition, we inevitably fall into judicial tyranny. Without an objective standard for determining whether a right is actually implied in an amendment, the court could just make up whatever rights it wants to and impose their own values tyrannically on the rest of us. And it is tyrannical because they have no accountability, and the judges are unelected and they serve for life. And so this text and tradition standard is absolutely essential for the prevention of tyranny from the bench. And so, as the Alito summary decision made absolutely clear, there is obviously no mention of abortion in the text. And then when we go to the tradition for when the 14th Amendment was passed, 1868, we find that virtually everywhere in the country, abortion was a crime. Again, for right or for wrong, this is has nothing to do with the reasoning here at this point. When you go to the history, the time of when the 14th Amendment was passed, abortion was illegal in the United States. There was nothing in the time period that suggests in any way, shape, or form that abortion was a right protected under the 14th Amendment as it was intended by those who passed it. And so the point that the Trump court made was that the Roe decision in 1973 violated that dual principle of text and tradition. Abortion failed both tests, and therefore, and this is key, therefore, the court concluded that the practice of abortion is not a part of the rights protected under the U.S. Constitution. And because it's not part of the rights protected under the U.S. Constitution, the federal government, including the Supreme Court, has no basis to impose the issue one way or another on the states. And so this is an issue based on our federalist hierarchical structure of government. This is an issue that has to go back to the states. Whatever is not addressed by the U.S. Constitution, by definition, is decided by the individual states and the consent of the governed. And that's that. The era of Roe v. Wade, perhaps the single worst tyrannical decision ever made on the Supreme Court, has come to an end. So this was a term like no other. It was a term when the Supreme Court faithfully answered the call. And that's the call that we all originally responded to when we ignored the incessant rantings of neocon never-Trumpers back in 2016, many of whom, by the way, are taking victory laps with this Roe v. Wade overturning, ironically. Some of them are apologizing. They have the humility to do so. And so I would be remiss, in light of the answering to this call, I would be remiss if I didn't mention how President Trump responded when he was told that the court, his court, officially overturned Roe v. Wade. When he was asked what he thought of the decision, he simply said, God made the decision. Over to you, gang. Let's get some of your questions. As our producer, Josh, is getting them lined up here for me. Remember, we obviously can't say everything that needs to be said about politically correct, sensitive issues on social media platforms. And so that's why you need to become a Turley Talks Insiders Club member, every one of you. Every Monday night, we have a live Q&A with yours truly, as well as some of our special guests like Mike Lindell, Sebastian Gorka, and others. You get to ask us your questions. We talk about anything and everything without any worry of cancel culture. So just click on the link below, sign up to be an Insiders Club member for less than the price of a cup of coffee per day, and you're going to have a fun time every single Monday night. We have a live stream going on there that you're going to love. All right, let's take a look at some of these questions. All right, let's start with Live Freedom. God bless it. And again, thank you everybody for these super chats here. Did anything change for the midterms? Is it the same? No. If anything, it's going to be more Republican. So Patrick Basham of the Democracy Institute did a very, very good study on this, and he found that the people most motivated to vote abortion as a single issue are pro-life women, overwhelmingly. Every study shows that. Pro-life women, overwhelmingly, are the single most motivated voter to vote on abortion as their single issue. So the irony is there's the people who are most pro-abortion today are men. It's middle-aged men and young men too, but they don't vote for it. They don't. It's not anywhere near their priorities or their hierarchy of values for voting. As a matter of fact, there was, I think, I can't remember who it was that came out. Was it YouGov or Politico? But what they listed it just earlier this week, they listed all the different factors of priorities of what you're going to vote for, economy, inflation, all that sort of stuff. The Roe v. Wade decision came in dead last. So no, I don't think it's going to do anything. Bridget, happy Independence Day, and a happy Independence Day to you. Thank you so much for the gift. Mitchell Ryan, what do you think will happen with the ending of Stay in Mexico? All right, well, so it's going to open the floodgates again. Again, sending a message to south of the border that the red carpet is out for you guys. And again, keep in mind the ending of the Mexico policy, while I don't agree with the decision in the end, because I do think it is a violation of the duties of upholding the Constitution. Nevertheless, the Supreme Court justices, consistent to their rationale for making decisions, they basically said it's not their job to determine whether or not a Trump era policy can stay in place. It's the voters' job, and so voters picked, bike riding Biden, and so he gets to make that decision, and then it's the Congress and it's future elections that are going to decide whether or not they like that decision. So that's where they came. I do think, keep in mind, Latinos are defecting en masse. It's mind spinning how fast Latinos are abandoning the Democratic Party. We have to remember that when all is said and done, while Latinos and Hispanics south of the border may be far more to the left on economics than many of us are comfortable with, nevertheless, they are actually, ironically, far more to the right when it comes to the cultural issues and the anti-woke issues than even white voters are, right? White voters are known as the Republican conservative, supremacist voter and all that. It's actually Hispanics. Hispanics are far, every poll shows that Hispanics are the single most pro-life demographic in the country, single most traditional marriage and the like. They despise wokeness. And so this is going to come back ultimately to bite the Democrats. The question is how long? How long? Are we going to be in an interim period where all of these immigrants that are coming across the border illegally, getting red carpet treatment, are we going to be in a period where they kind of get enticed by this cultural Marxist, woke nonsense, identity politics and the like? because that certainly did happen in the Latino community for the last couple of decades? Or are they going to go more with the predominant Latino community that's established here in the United States, that's starting to vote overwhelmingly Republican, like Myra Flores just experienced, a couple of weeks back? Thank you, Mitchell. Again, Mitchell, no, but he's ignoring the Supreme Court. Can he get away with this, or there will not with the stay in Mexico policy? I don't know where you're coming with that, Mitchell. The Supreme Court said he can, as I understand it, he can get rid of the stay in Mexico policy. Base streaming at cozy.tv. Christian nationalism on the rise, and America First is unstoppable. Great Reset, more like Great Awakening. I love it. There is a book. There's an Alexander Dugin book out there that I think is called Great Reset versus the Great Awakening. And you're right. I mean, I wouldn't even call it Christian nationalism per se, because I don't think there's necessarily an ideology there. I would call it more broadly retraditionalization. And that's what I was going to do a video this week on it, but we just had too many other things. But the left is obsessed with Christian nationalism, right wing, Christian. They're calling it Christian fascism. They're calling it, Mika Brzezinski was saying that the other day. I did a video on that, just debunking all of her nonsense. They think there is this particular movement that is taking over, and it's got this ideology, and it's trying to superimpose upon. What they don't see, and maybe there is, it's going to be small and peripheral, but what they don't see is that, Latinos, working class, women without college degrees, the black men are more and more saying, wait a minute now, this globalism is absurd. This wokeism is nuts. It's not for me. Let's go back. Let's return. And when you return to nation, culture, custom, and tradition, by definition, you're returning to a far more traditionalist conception of life. And that's going to involve here in the United States a far more Christian conception of life. So that's where and then that inevitably pervades politics and the like. So the evil demon that they always try to scare people with Christian nationalism is actually just retraditionalism when all is said and done, reawakening. So just like you said, perfectly put. Kathy Mello, dissolve the government, make it a Trump dynasty, ultra MAGA king. There you go. Dansman, softball question for you at last. I know you spent time in England, but out of the Trinity, Danny Morris, Shane Bond, Simon Duell, all Kiwis. I'm not quite Ant's best. So New Zealand is coming out. I don't quite understand the question. So I'm sorry, Dansman. I'll have to, let's see. Let me try. Best out of the Trinity. Danny Moore. I want to get Shane Bond, Simon Duell. Yeah, if it's a question on New Zealand politics, I have to admit a lot of ignorance there. Unfortunately, and it's my fault. So I wish I could answer better. OSHA, HHS, USDA, EPA, right? All the administrative state, right? All the other. This is Adam Bowman. All the other alphabet agencies need to be shut down as unconstitutional. Congress has for a century pawned their responsibility off on unelected bureaucrats. You are definitely voicing something that is growing in popularity, Adam, especially with these clear abuses. You at least got the abuses reined in. We'll see what happens with the actual agencies themselves in the coming years. Apex, Caliber, Trump's 2024 nomination secured thanks to SCOTUS? Yeah, I think so. I think this is going to be a rematch 2020. Well, it's not a rematch. Where they want the MAGA crowd wants 2020 vindicated and corrected, and that's how they're going to. Trump has got this wrapped up, at least at this point. We'll see how things go. Theophrastus, well-regulated back then, meant what we call well-practiced. It didn't mean government registration. A good seamstress was well-regulated. Thank you, Theophrastus. Absolutely. Again, just even the wording itself, just from a exegetical point of view, the wording itself, the right to bear arms is for the citizens is the prerequisite to having a militia. So you got it. There's no way around that. Steve Gunning, God chose you and I for such a time as this. Amen. Little Esther theology in there. You got it. Absolutely. And it's an amazing God in all of his wisdom and sovereignty, God foreordained that we would be the ones alive at this time. And so that's why I said we're answering a call. Maryland, Dagoti, do you think amnesty will fail? I do. I think the pushback on the Second Amendment betrayal from those 14 Republican senators was so hard. I mean, so I don't think they're going to win re-election. So I don't see it. I don't see amnesty coming, but we'll see. Again, they can do it in the end. And amnesty, keep in mind, does take about 10 years to fully work itself out. But in the end, it's going to be simply granting amnesty to an increasingly Republican demographic. So they're shooting themselves in the foot either way. And there's a whole theory and scholarly trajectory to why that's happening that we can get into. The Dragon Rider, New Mexico is in trouble. The Republican candidate is a weatherman who hates Trump and still supports partial birth abortions, or partial abortion. I'm assuming it's partial, but only chance to save state is to elect Libertarian candidate Karen Benany, Patriot Full Navajo. You should interview. Okay, I'll take a look, Dragon Rider. Absolutely. Live Freedom, what's the story on Texas wanting independence? Okay, so, well, we'll see. We'll see on that one. So that's Dan Miller, Texas Nationalist Movement. It's obviously something called Texit, named after Brexit, that wants independence. It's very much there. It's very much part of what's known as re-territorialization. It's a fascinating term, but basically as the world's becoming less globalist, back up, globalism deterritorializes politics away from the local, away from the regional, right? And it locates it around the bullies in Brussels or around the dolts in D.C., right? So it centralizes political decision-making. As globalism begins to collapse, inevitably politics gets re-territorialized. It goes back to the local. Very exactly what we just saw with the reversal Roe v. Wade. But when it gets re-territorialized, we can't quite control how that power gets re-territorialized. And one of the ways it gets re-territorialized is with a MAGA movement, America first, right? Poland first, Brazil first. Tucker's been interviewing Jair Bolsonaro, which has been so wonderful. Hungary first and the like. So we are seeing a re-territorialization in what's called civic nationalism, where we're having a renewed sense of nation and culture and custom and the like. But it's also, as we're seeing with Russia and China and India, this new post-globalist world is re-territorializing around the reawakening of civilizations. Again, the old Chinese civilization, the old Indian civilization, the old Neo-Byzantine civilization, Russia. We're seeing it in Egypt. The ruling parties in Egypt are re-embracing pharaonic myths, the pharaoh, in their history and their whole self-conception identity. Turkey is reimagining itself in terms of an Ottoman Empire. So we're seeing the revitalization of the nation state. We're seeing the reawakening of civilization states, but we're also seeing a kind of more micro-tribalization reawakening as well. And that's where people want to sort of break off from the larger nation-state project and create their own sovereign states around identity markers such as region, religion, and race. And so obviously Texit would be a re-territorialization around region and region and religion. It's definitely a very, faith, family, and free Christian like movement. But it doesn't matter in the end what your religion is per se. It's just the Texit movement sees Washington, D.C. as absolutely irredeemable. But there have been a number of articles that have come out this week that have said, why do you want Texit when you're winning? When you're winning, when Texit sensibilities and dispositions and philosophy is actually winning in Washington D.C. So we'll see where it is right now after all of this. Let's see, Toddzilla. Any guess on if when Trump will announce 2024 run? And who would be a good VP at this time? Have no idea when he's going to announce. And any, solid MAGA governor would be an excellent VP running. Everyone's saying DeSantis. I don't think it'll be DeSantis. I think DeSantis wants to remain DeSantis. He's doing so much good in Florida, keeping that state a thoroughly red state right now, especially as we're reading. I'll do a video on this next week. We're starting to read reports now that Democrats are leaving. They're fleeing red states. So the red states now are going to get redder and redder and redder. And like myself, leftugees are considering leaving blue states now. So we're going to start, again, this is part of this re-territorialization that continues here in the United States in a post-globalist America. Dansman, New Zealand, real question now. Ucker seems to be very anti-Chinese, very scared, big in Africa and big in South America and Pacific. Still nothing to be scared of. We'll see. Look, China is a tough one. It's a tough nut to crack at this point. I went with Olavo Carvalho's conception that China was an alternative globalism. So the United States was an economic globalism, and China represented a political, a statist, Marxist, Leninist globalism. But the comments that have been coming out of China of late are so it's so interlocked with the necessity, the foundational necessity of culture for their civilization to work, that they don't seem to be able to, they're not going to be able to break out of the civilization state mold, which says they certainly want to take over a sphere of the world, but they don't want to take over the world. They're just not interested in it. So we'll have to see. There's certainly a threat if you're in the South Pacific, if you're Kiwi and Australia and the like, or the Asiatic countries. Sure, you've got issues, but then you've got India that's offering a hedge of protection against that. Russia as well, now establishing itself as a core state around all the major Orthodox nations and the like. So we'll see. Stephen, I live in Connecticut. Hey, my old stomping grounds right outside of New Haven, Orange. Do you think we have any chance of going red? No. No. I think right now, after this decision, at least the pattern that we can, give a little guesstimate on is that, if anything, we're going to harden. Red states are going to get more red. Blue states are going to get more blue. That's just the way it is. It's sad. I love Connecticut. But Connecticut is just, it's every single county votes blue on a presidential election. It's a disaster. Genuine Draft, American Thinker article yesterday says Dems will run Michelle O in 2024. Your thought? Well, they've been saying they're going to run Michelle O now for forever. Obviously since 2016. So I don't know. We'll see. I don't see any indication of that, but we'll see. Is the price of gold? This is Tom Greer. Is the price of gold being artificially suppressed? And when do you think gold will really go up? I do wonder that, because we're becoming much, much more of an commodity-based worldwide economy. The worldwide economy can be more or less broken down into three things, right? Food, fuel, and finance. And globalists thought that by controlling finance, we can control the world. And so that's globalism. That's the Dolts and Davos and everything like that. What Russia is proving is that actually it's the one who controls food and fuel that controls the world. So we're becoming a very commodities-based economy, and that's in sense a post-globalist world, a post-globalist society. So I think the articles I've read said gold should shoot through the roof. We're talking 10,000 an ounce in the not-so-distant future, precisely because now countries are going to be this was the argument, countries are going to be very hesitant in dumping their dollar surplus, the dollar being the default currency for now, right? But they're going to be very hesitant of dumping their dollar surplus into treasury bonds, because or into anything that remains a dollar. Because what they saw the Western nations do to Russia, which was basically steal their foreign reserves. So it's become an unhedgeable confiscation risk to invest in the dollar if you're outside of the United States or Western Europe. And so gold, the theory as it went is gold and other kind of commodities would be the obvious option for that. We haven't seen the price go up yet. It hasn't hit the 2K mark or shot through the 2K mark. It's been very, very frustrating, very stagnant. But it has not been losing like everything else. And then the same theory, though, that also gets me a little worried. The same theory thought that we could see Bitcoin hitting 1 million because crypto is not so much a currency as much as a transaction platform. And with the weaponization of SWIFT, a society of worldwide, interbanking financial transaction or telecommunication, with the weaponizing, so kicking Russia off, threatening India, threatening China, we're getting kicked off SWIFT, which doesn't matter because they've got their own financial transaction platforms. The theory was that would make crypto all the more valuable because it provides sort of an untouchable transaction platform. But alas, I mean, crypto has been sinking thus far. So we'll have to see. But we are going into more and more. It's recognized we're going into a commodities-based economy. Yes, you Austrian economists you're getting vindicated here big time. So there's no question that I think we're going to continue to see gold at least stay stable through this process, as opposed to collapsing. It should stay stable and hopefully rock and roll at some point. All right, guys, great seeing you. Have a wonderful, wonderful patriotic weekend. A happy July 4th to everyone all over the world. A happy nation culture, custom tradition celebration weekend to you and yours. In your own spheres, you have so much to be proud of and to adore in terms of the inheritance that you've been gifted, that we have all been gifted in our own spheres. So God bless you guys. Take care. I'll see you next week.